Welcome to the Friday Reporter. I'm Lisa Camooso Miller. For almost 2 decades, my guest today told America what had already happened in Washington. Now her job is helping tell America what's about to. Carrie Dann spent nearly 18 years in NBC News' Washington bureau as an embedded campaign reporter, an editor, and most recently, overseeing the network's Capitol Hill team before becoming managing editor of the Cook Political Report. Today we're talking about what changes when you move from reporting the story to forecasting it, and what she's learned in her first stretch on the inside of one of the most trusted names in political analysis. So Carrie, you spent almost 2 decades reporting what already happened, and now you're in the prediction space for news. Talk to me a little bit about what that transition was like for you.
Well, I think for the many years that I was at NBC News, a lot of what I was covering was individual races. And obviously at a big national network, there's only so many races that really break through. I would sort of joke about the midterms, really coverage at a big network like that maybe starts in October, really, that the networks are really paying close attention, especially for a midterm. And obviously in presidential years, the presidential race blots out the sun. And the Cook Political Report is very focused on watching these races as they're developing, which allows us to project more about what we think the outcomes are going to be. Because our editors are following the primaries, for example, they are looking back historically at how members have performed in districts. They're looking at fundraising data. We meet a lot of the candidates, which allows us to get a real feel for the texture of these individual people who at the end of the day are human beings who are running for elected office. And so it's a very different approach, and it really allows us to have a very granular knowledge of individual races that lets us sort of reliably look at, okay, when the rubber hits the road on election day, what do we think each of these candidates is, and how are they going to be able to perform?
And I love that. When I talked earlier today with Erin, she mentioned that you visit with the candidates, especially the top tier or the most busy or viable candidates that you think are interesting to know. That's for a team of just 9. That is an incredible undertaking. Like, I can't get over how much, but also it's really important. And to me, for someone like yourself, you covered 10 national elections, as you said, for NBC. Did any of that change that experience that you had for the 10 race? So much has changed over that time too. And now you're actually meeting the candidates. Talk to me a little bit about how that informs the questions that you ask when you're in the room with them. I'm so curious about how that evolution has come for you.
In some ways, covering that many elections, in some ways, I have to remind myself how much the political landscape has changed. Because when I first started covering, the first election that I covered was 2006.
Yeah.
2008, I remember being on the road and having somebody describe to me what Twitter was, and me saying, like, "What you want me to do? What you want me to report in real time? Not." And obviously, the window has changed so much about what is acceptable to the American people, what kinds of candidates they are willing to accept. I mean, I covered the 2008 presidential race, right? That race between 2 politicians who were reasonably popular. There weren't very many people out there in the commentators saying, if Barack Obama wins, it's going to be the end of democracy as we know it. Or if John McCain wins, it's going to be the end of democracy as we know it. Now, obviously, the stakes are very different, and we live in a much more polarized world. So sometimes I have to check myself on my priors. If there's a candidate who has, for example, a sex scandal, right, that may have broken their candidacy 10 years prior. And now sort of there's a whole different set of standards for conduct and how politicians can and cannot be successful. Obviously, also the landscape when it comes to money in politics has changed immensely and continues to change. So those are things that I have to sometimes keep in mind myself, that the world that I grew up in covering politics is no longer the world that we live in now, both from a media perspective and from the perspective of what voters are finding palatable, and the degree to which they're putting on their jerseys and doing very little evaluation of a political party that is not their own.
Right. No, and there's no doubt about that. It's changed so much. But also too, like, I think that I love that you say that, because I find myself reminding people that when they say that's not the way it happened or that's not the way these things work, because the rules themselves have changed so dramatically from the time that you were covering and I was covering these kinds of things. I was working on the campaigns. The world is tremendously. My first race was in 1992, like a million years ago. I'm curious though, when you make a transition from NBC and from covering national elections in terms of how they're coming together, what surprised you the most about Cook Political Report when you arrived there on the scene about how they do their work there?
Well, I think I was so mystified by the race ratings process. And
Mm.
my colleagues, when I joined the Political Report, I think kind of had a laugh at my expense because of like the reverence with which, as a former journalist and reporter on these races, I was sort of like, I envisioned these stone tablets coming down from Amy Walter on high of like, this is how we pronounce how these races are going to turn out. And getting to see it from the inside has really been eye opening for me because it is not one, two, three, or four calculations. It is so holistic the way that we look at each of these races. And we take into account candidate quality. Like I said, when we meet these candidates, sometimes you can just get a sense of like, this is a really talented politician who may be able to overperform just what the raw numbers are on the ground. We look at historical data, we do look at that fundraising data, and the national political environment, and all of that together. It is a very delicate dance, and neither sort of art nor science. It's in between. It's very quantitative, but it's also very qualitative. And I think what makes the Cook Political Report unique is that we are doing that work in terms of not making it entirely quantitative and just looking at the numbers in a given district. We're looking at a whole array of factors, and it's so thoughtful. And obviously the stakes are very high for us. We need to get it right. So sometimes we don't move quite as quickly as some other prognosticators out there, but it's because we are so devoted to getting it right and
Uh,
also to taking into account a lot of factors that I don't think, if you're looking just at spreadsheets all day, you're not really considering.
no question about it. And I think that it's really, to me, very important that you do it that way, especially now, because for so long we relied so heavily on polling. And it's over the course of time, you and I both remember sort of the evolution, how challenged polling has become, that you can't just look at the data. There has to be a more holistic view of how these races come together and how you predict. But your job at Cook Political is to be the managing editor, which puts you squarely in the space between editorial and business. Talk a little bit about your role there at the report.
Right. And this has been new to me because I came entirely from a background where I never had to think about a budgeting sheet. I was not in a position where I was making business decisions at a company as enormous as NBC Universal and Comcast.
Mhm.
And, now we're a very small team. So everybody does a little bit of everything. But it has been a really revealing process to me to look at the business decisions that we make at the Cook Political Report that allow us to remain viable in a very swiftly changing media environment. There aren't a whole lot of people who are doing what we do in terms of having a subscription base that is highly specialized. We don't take advertising money. And again, we are such a small team. We have to make choices about what our bandwidth is, what we do and don't write about, who we are, who we're not, and staying true to a nonpartisan brand, which is also a space that there's very few people in who are trying to be genuinely nonpartisan. Our jobs is not to tell you which outcome of this election is better. Our job is to tell you what we think is going to happen in individual races and the national political environment as a whole.
How do you protect against that? That the nonpartisan reputation is so inherently important to what you do. How do you protect that brand at a time when you're being pulled in a dozen different directions, either from one pole to the other, or really just about all of the discussions that are happening? How do you maintain that?
I think part of what we do is we can point at the scoreboard
Mm.
for how many of these races we have accurately predicted in the past. And I don't think when you have objective information like that, you can't complain if you're a partisan on one side or the other. And also, we have to make these arguments all the time. This is a current political environment that hasn't been great for Republicans. Republicans are often unhappy with the decisions that we're making when we're moving races in Democrats' direction. And what I and Aaron and the other editors have to say to folks when they do voice concerns of that from a partisan direction is, hey, when it was a good year for you guys, we moved stuff in towards Republicans as well. So we do have to protect that legacy really at all costs because it's the most important thing about our brand is that we're not putting a thumb on the scale for either side. Again, our job is to try to explain to both parties, what we think is going to happen. It also is in their best interests for us to accurately reflect the political environment, because when either, professional Republicans or professional Democrats here in Washington are trying to ask donors for money or trying to direct resources, they're looking at our ratings as a sense of where their resources can be best spent. So they have it in their best interest for us to reflect accurately what's going on in the political environment on any given day.
And it's not necessarily those that are donors, but the consumers of this kind of information, about political information. What would you say is a trend that in how Americans are getting their political information that worries you?
I do find that people are very siloed in where they're getting information. And that's been a trend that's not news to you or anybody else,
Mhm.
that people are gravitating towards the same sources that they agree with. But we live in such an environment where you could literally be sitting on a plane next to somebody and consuming news for the entire plane ride and not consuming a single source that is the same, or even like a single piece of information that is the same. We live in such a fractured environment that it is very easy, if you want to go find political information that supports your beliefs and accelerates your belief in one partisan direction or another. It's very easy to do that. And it's very easy to believe that everybody around you is consuming the same news as you are, when in fact, that's very much not the case.
Yeah, and there's no doubt. I mean, I have 2 teenagers that live in my home, 1 teenager, 1 20-year-old, and where they get their information is so wildly different from myself and from my husband. So everyone here, it's interesting you say that about sitting on the plane. Living in the house that I live in,
Right.
everyone's source is a little bit different. Are there any trends in how we're gathering information that gives you hope?
I do think that there is sort of a collaboration that social media has allowed, that it allows, for example, new voices to be heard.
Mm.
You can be a first time candidate and with very little infrastructure, for example, and go viral and make a name for yourself and maybe change the conversation within your party. You can be a young reporter who's very talented, who otherwise might have, in a previous life, in my television life, might have languished in a small market, but has the ability to create a following online and
Mm.
maybe add, and accelerate their career. So I do think that one thing I appreciate about social media is it does remove some of the barriers to entry, especially for young people who may have very smart ideas about either governing or reporting, and they can, use that as leverage to build their own brands, and be successful and maybe change the conversation in the country.
Let me unpack this just for a moment and tell me where I'm getting it wrong. Cook Political Report does political analysis, reports out on it, doesn't take advertising dollars, and relies entirely on subscriptions, and is nonpartisan. A
That's
lot of those
right.
decisions are big. Those are big decisions at a time when those are not the trends. What is it that people misunderstand about how Cook Political actually works?
I think we do. I mentioned the race ratings, which is obviously what we are the most known for.
Mm.
I think it can be a little bit reductive, though, to focus just on that, because we do so many other things. We write about every single primary race, and also we write about races where it's, a solid R or a solid D race that aren't really getting covered anywhere else. We write about those because it's important for people to know who's going to represent them, and it's
Yeah.
important for people in Washington to know, okay, like the primary is a fait accompli. Whoever wins the primary in most House districts is going to go on to represent that district in Congress, just because of our polarized system. And so we are writing about all of those things. We have a poll tracker. We conduct our own polling. We've got a polling project this cycle that looks specifically at competitive House districts.
Mm.
So it's a kind of a different slice of data that a lot of other people aren't doing. And so I think one thing that people misunderstand a little bit about the brand is thinking that all we do is, stroke our chins and think about what the outcome of these races is going to be. We're writing about them all the time and sharing that information with our subscribers because we know they need it.
Mm. What's a race right now that you think is being undercovered?
Undercovered. I'm really interested by all of the races in Iowa. Iowa's near and dear to my heart. My first big political gig at NBC was the Iowa embed. So I
Um,
lived in Des Moines in 2007, which was a real ride, as you might remember.
mhm.
But I think it's a really interesting state, and the Senate race is a live ball. We have it in a lean R category. I can imagine that going to a toss up at some point this cycle.
Mm.
Josh Turek is the nominee that Democrats really wanted. He's got a very compelling story. And Democrats are really excited about their gubernatorial nominee in Rob Stand, who looks like he may be favored ultimately to win that race. So it's a state that's really interesting. The political DNA is there. I think a lot of people write it off as a, flyover state,
Sure.
deep, deep red, evangelical. And it is many of those things, but I think it's much more nuanced and could be a race to keep an eye on.
Talk a little bit about being an embedded reporter. You did that twice, right?
Did.
Once in '08 and once in '12. I'm tired for you just thinking about it. Well,
I
talk a
accumulated a lot of hotel points, I'll tell you that.
I'm sure that you did. Talk a little bit about what that was like. Were you on one side of the tell me a little bit about those 2 opportunities for you.
I mean, it was the best political education I possibly could have gotten. To live in Iowa, where in 2008, which was a very volatile race, it was very unclear, how that race was going to turn out, and getting to see Barack Obama's infrastructure on the ground in these very small towns in Iowa, where I would go to an event. I remember very vividly, Michelle Obama had an event in a small town in Iowa, and when I was walking in and setting up my stuff, the campaign volunteers knew everybody who was attending by name. And that was the first moment that I was like, he's going to win because they have built this political infrastructure that can overcome all of the strikes against him
Mm,
as this newcomer candidate. So I got to learn by living in that community. I got to learn how the candidates were or were not connecting with regular voters.
mm,
In 2012, I also had an instructive experience. I won't tell you which of my bosses, but my boss said, "You know what? We're going to give you the best assignment. You might be, he's probably going to be the nominee. You might be going to the White House." And I was assigned to cover Rick Perry.
mm,
Spoiler alert: he did not win the Republican nomination, but I learned so much from seeing a campaign fall apart. Campaigns that are unsuccessful teach you a lot more, I think, as a reporter, that campaigns that are successful. And I got to sort of see that in real time and see why everybody in Washington had it wrong that he was going to be this amazing, strong frontrunner for the Republican nomination, and why the reporters in Texas who knew him better knew how flawed that he could potentially be.
mm. That's fascinating. I remember sitting at lunch with another journalist at one point talking about how Bill Frist was going to be the nominee for and you see how that went. So,
It,
yes, it's difficult, the prognosis and the predicting of politics in general is so incredibly, uh, it fluctuates dramatically. It's so fun for me to
right.
watch what you guys are doing there. If you are looking now at elections, you're looking at the broad, all of it. You're seeing all of it, and you're digesting all of it. What's a story that you wish more people were paying attention to now?
A story that I'm going to pause here because I want to give you a thoughtful response on that.
Mhm.
Um, I think one of the stories that people are paying attention to, but I think is going to take on a lot of urgency, is about our election systems and election integrity. There's a lot of anxiety out there already about, and much of it is politically inflicted.
Yes.
Much of it is by design.
Mm,
But a Gallup had new data just last week that found, I think, half of Americans were concerned their own ballot was not going to be counted correctly.
mhm,
That's a really alarming stat to me, that there is so little faith that our elections are legitimate, and what it could yield is, even in a potential wave year, a lot of Americans not believing that they're being represented by the person who their families and friends and communities voted to represent them, to
mhm,
have represent them. So I do think that there is a lot of coverage about it, but I also would love to see a more urgency, I think, from elected officials and from elections officials, to make sure that people have maybe more of a faith in the electoral system, because it could lead down a very dangerous path and also render moot what we do at the Good Political Report if people aren't
Yeah.
actually buying the outcome of elections.
Well, for so long in politics, we have worked so hard to get people to be more engaged in the process and
Mhm.
to be more because voter turnout had always been historically very low. Even in presidential races, it was under 50%. I mean, and I'm probably getting those numbers wrong. I can't even believe I quoted a number to Cook Political. I'm fired
Yeah.
from my job.
I don't
Um, but
I don't
I
have
know
it in front of me
that
either,
the
but
numbers, I would say, then even in a presidential year, the numbers were not representative of the majority. That I know
Mhm.
to be true. And so we've always worked to try to get more people engaged in the process. And it feels as if this narrative that you mentioned, I'm really glad that you brought it up, is one that's doing the opposite. It's forcing people to stay home or to lose their confidence in the way the system works. And it puts the onus not necessarily on the national system as much as it puts the responsibility and the burden on our local elected officials and our local election officials. And that's something that's heavily strained because their resources also are so dramatically depleted. So it is, I think, an issue to watch and one that I love that you brought up because it is one, even though widely reported, not enough coverage still today, I think. So I tend to agree with you there. I will be watching it closely. Would you say, so election day, for those people who haven't, and Aaron and I geeked out on this a little bit,
Mhm.
we lead up to election day. We get all the way to election day and then the polls open. Now I know we can talk early voting and we can talk all those other things, but actual election day tends to be an incredibly quiet day. It is the quietest day I think of the year. I had someone tell me they were going to start to put together like a breakfast happy hour so people could just start
Right.
getting after it in the morning because the day doesn't really start until about 8 o'clock. And
That's
then,
right.
there's all of these things and then it goes late into the night for the most part, even if it's just, from 8 until the polls close on the West Coast. Is there a particular ritual or a food or a something that
Mm.
you do on election day that keeps you busy and active, until the results start to come in?
I have been known to stress eat, an entire bag of Twizzlers and have no memory of it afterwards,
Mhm.
on election night. So that would be probably the unflattering one. One thing I do always try to do on election days is to go outside, and even if it's a freezing or a raining day in November, I do like to spend some time in the middle of the day, wandering around in the city or something to also to remind me that life goes on.
Yeah.
Other people's lives are going on and not everybody is hanging on every single election results, as important as they are. There's a lot of people who are just going about their lives. And I think that's an important thing to remember is that, this election will come and go and it will have a huge impacts on the American people, but also, touch some grass and this, this too shall
Remind
pass
yourself.
of the stress of covering elections.
The one thing I wanted to get to before I let you go today was, most specifically, Carrie, I what advice do people give you about making the transition from being a journalist to being in this managing editor role? Did they give you advice about how to make that transition specifically? Because it seems like so much of it really is, as much as it's all part of the same ecosystem, it is a dramatically different job and a very different job.
It is, and I think one of the reasons, I chose to leave NBC, and I, love and admire all of my colleagues there, and I think that they do amazing work. But one thing that I struggled with there was, because the media environment is changing so quickly, there were so many demands, and there was always the volume was always sort of at an 11 or 12.
Mhm.
Everything seemed to take on equal importance, just because the news cycle was changing so fast, and we
Oh, yeah.
obviously are an environment and, this was before MSNBC and NBC split, so we were serving 2 different masters, and I really wanted a change of pace to go someplace with a little bit more volume control, and the Cook Political Report is exactly that. It is a place where we strive not to be reactive. We are always thinking, "You know what? Even if the political narrative around a certain, there is a sex scandal or there is a development with a candidacy. And sometimes I think the national media can overreact to vibes. And we always try to take a step back and evaluate what really matters and whether or not the fundamentals have really changed in some of these races just because they are in the news or not in the news. And that was something that I really wanted to I had to train myself to do.
Yeah.
I remember coming into meetings when I first started at the political report being like, we got to remove this race. And Aaron would say, well, what? That person is not going to win just because they're in the news, And so I was humbled a little bit by that, but it's, I think, made me a better analyst and journalist to be able to take that time and not have to react or have an opinion on every single thing as it happens, but rather to take a step back and look to how individual developments play into the larger narrative about an upcoming election.
I think that that's such an important point that you made there. And it's one that I've made when I talk to communications people too. The rate and the speed in which news moves has actually allowed us to be a little more deliberate and thoughtful.
Right.
Because now there are a lot of people, the news specifically has to chase everything because that's the ecosystem of what they do. But for folks like yourself and for folks in communications, we can actually take a collective pause and decide whether or not this is something that's going to stick or we're going to be moving very quickly on to the next whatever it is. So it seems to me like as fast as things are moving, there's also been an opportunity for us to be a little bit more reflective before reacting right away.
That's right. And I always try to remind myself too, voters and candidates are human people and they don't always fit into a decision matrix that makes sense to the eggheads in Washington. Voters are all very unique, but they are driven by their lived experience. They are driven by the issues that are right in front of them, which is why every election is about the economy. This one is no exception. But I do try to remind myself of that a lot because I do think there's a lot of folks in Washington who will get very hung up on individual stories that matter a lot inside the Beltway that are not going to change a single voter's mind outside of 495.
No, and it's fascinating. And I can't wait to share this conversation. I can't wait to keep watching what you guys are doing. Carrie, it has been a thrill to have you. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Carrie, thank you so much. What stayed with me is that the people we trust to tell us what's coming next in politics are so often the same people who spent years in the room when the last thing happened. That's not a small thing. That's earned judgment. Thanks for joining us on the Friday Reporter. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share it with someone who wants to understand how the analysis they read actually gets made. See you next time.